Muscles. Everyone has them, and everyone uses them. The average person takes about 5,000 to 10,000 steps a day. At least 10 muscles are involved in putting one leg in front of the other. But in actuality, probably more like 200 are involved. It's obvious that we use muscles when we're moving, but what about when we're sitting or laying down quietly? That's right. You use many muscles even at rest. For example, your back and neck muscles are working if you're sitting up or walking. Your intercostal muscles, these muscles that are between your ribs, are working if you're breathing. And by the way, I hope that you are breathing, so hopefully those intercostals are working. Muscles which control your eye movements are working to adjust how much light enters your eye, and they are contracting to move your eyeballs so you can see whatever it is you're looking at. Even more importantly, muscles are contracting to move the lens in your eye so that you can focus on what you're looking at. Add to that that your heart is beating away by itself without you having to think about it. Muscles actually make up about 40% of your body weight, and without them, human life could not exist. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe muscle functions kind of generally. This, by the way, is a typical essay question for your next exam, so pay attention. You also should be able to describe the special characteristics of muscle. So what makes muscle different from other organs in the body? You should be able to describe the 3 types of muscle and describe muscle organization. The major function of all muscle in the body is to create movement through contraction. When we think about a muscle contraction, usually the first thing that comes to mind is that a muscle is shortening, kind of like a biceps muscle does when we make a muscle. For this class, contraction doesn't mean that a muscle is shortening. Instead, contraction means that we are generating tension within a muscle, not necessarily shortening it. Other functions of your muscle include creating volume and pressure changes. For example, when you breathe, it's the contraction of muscles like the diaphragm and the relaxation of the intercostals that actually changes the volume of the thoracic cavity, allowing us to inhale and exhale air. Our muscles also help maintain our body posture and position. As you sit in a chair, muscles along the spine contract to hold your spine erect. Muscles stabilize joints. They also generate heat. So think about in the wintertime when you go outside and you don't have quite enough layers on to keep you warm. As you're out there, what begins to happen? Eventually your muscles start to shiver and quiver, right? What's happening inside of your muscles is that, yes, they're doing lots of mini contractions, and driving that is the breakdown of ATP. When ATP gets broken down, there's a little puff of heat that's released as well. And as that happens across all of the muscles in your body, it generates heat. Your muscles are also involved in communication. All of the facial expressions that you make when you smile, you frown, when you're surprised or angry, they wouldn't be possible without muscle contractions. Your muscles contract along your throat to allow you to swallow. And then, did you know that your muscles are actually involved in allowing you to hear? The stapedius is the smallest muscle in the body and is connected to one of your ossicles called the stapes. It modifies sound so that we can hear it. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Now, because the cells in your skeletal muscle tissue and your smooth muscle tissue can be elongated, those cells can sometimes be called muscle fibers. Now let's take a look at the 3 types of muscle in a bit of detail. Skeletal muscles, like what you see here on the left, are attached to bone and skin in the human body. When these muscles contract, they can move limbs or alternatively stabilize body structures. Skeletal muscles contract rapidly and tire easily and can be very powerful. If we look at this tissue under the microscope, we'll see that it's composed of long cylindrical cells. So here's an example of a cell. Okay. And these long cylindrical cells are called myofibers. Myofibers, M-Y-O-F-I-B-E-R-S. The cells run parallel to each other and are striped. The striping pattern is called striation. And as we'll see later in these lectures, it shows the arrangement of functional units called sarcomeres in the cell. Sarcomere is S-A-R-C-O-M-E-R-E and then S for plural. Another characteristic of these tissues is that the cells are multinucleate. Because the cytoplasm of myofibers is chocked full of protein, the nuclei for these cells are pressed out to the periphery. That's what these purple ovals that you see here are. Skeletal muscle is under the conscious control of your nervous system. This means that the commands to contract these muscles and move your body as a result are made consciously, somewhere in your brain. Your brain, for example, might say, I need to write the letter A, and then it coordinates the contraction of your arm and hand muscles to make that happen. Cardiac muscle, here in the middle, makes up the bulk of the heart walls, and its contraction helps to pump blood. These muscles contract at a steady rate due to special cells called pacemaker cells in heart tissue. But the rate of contraction can be modified by the nervous system unconsciously. For example, if you needed to suddenly get up and run out of your home, your muscles would require more oxygen and nutrients from your blood. So your nervous system, without you thinking about it, would speed up the rate of your heart contraction in order to increase blood flow to your muscles. Cardiac muscle contraction is involuntary. It's controlled by your nervous system, but you don't have to think about it consciously. If we look at cardiac muscle under a microscope, two of the first things that we would notice is that the cells are striated and branched. The branches come together at special junctions. These are the vertical lines that you see here, called intercalated discs. I-N-T-E-R-C-A-L-A-T-E-D. D-I-S-C-S. Intercalated discs. Intercalated discs have gap junctions which allow the sharing of cytoplasm between adjacent cells. These cells are uninucleate, having only one nucleus. So the nucleus are the purple ovals again. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of your hollow organs, where they control the diameter of the organs. Going back to that example of you having to run out of your home, your skeletal muscles would need more oxygen to contract faster and get you out of your front door. Smooth muscles in the passageways that connect the lungs to your nose dilate or widen. This increases blood flow to the lungs. Now, after you stopped rushing and had a chance to relax, these muscles would then constrict somewhat or contract somewhat, adjusting airflow back to the body, back to normal. Smooth muscle is made up of long, non-striated cells. So the cells of smooth muscle are also called myofibers, just like we saw with the skeletal muscle. But unlike skeletal muscle, there's no striping. And unlike skeletal muscle also, we're going to see only one nucleus per cell. Your smooth muscle is under involuntary control, meaning that the nervous system controls the contraction of these muscles, but you don't consciously have to think about it. Now, muscle tissue has some characteristics that distinguishes it from, say, your epithelial tissues, your nervous tissue, and your connective tissues. There are 4 characteristics that you are responsible for knowing. The first is contractility. Contractility is the ability to generate tension or shorten when stimulated. And contractility is possible because muscles are metabolically active. They convert the energy of ATP into mechanical energy, which results in movement. And muscles are always contracting in your body. Your ability to kind of maintain your body temperature in part is because your cells are constantly breaking down ATP, and as they do that, there's a little release of heat, which keeps your body warm. Muscles that are always contracting in your body include those that help maintain your posture, those that help you breathe, and again, your heart muscles. The second special characteristic of muscle tissue is excitability. This is sometimes called responsiveness or irritability elsewhere. It basically means that muscle tissue can receive and respond to stimuli. We'll see this later in this chapter when we talk about how neurons send electrical impulses and chemical signals to your muscles, and your muscles may contract or relax in response. Your third special characteristic is extensibility. Muscles can be stretched, and stretching, not overstretching, but stretching, can be very useful in that it helps keep the muscles kind of flexible, strong, and healthy. Your final special characteristic of muscle tissue is elasticity. Although we can stretch our muscles, they can recoil back or return back to their resting length. For most of the remaining videos in this chapter, we will focus on the anatomy and physiology of skeletal muscle. There are 650 named skeletal muscles in the human body. Be happy that we'll only try to learn between 20 and 30 or so of them. It's estimated that there are actually 800 muscles in the body. It's just that many of them aren't named. The largest muscle of the human body is the gluteus maximus. Its function is to extend and rotate the hip. It's also involved in adducting and abducting the thigh. Although it's easy to think that the gluteus maximus helps cushion our bottoms as we sit, in actuality, this muscle isn't involved at all. The gluteus maximus is responsible for forceful movements like stepping onto a step, climbing, or running. Notice I didn't say walking. The gluteus maximus is usually not engaged during a leisurely stroll. The smallest muscle in the body is the stapedius. It helps to stabilize an auditory bone called the stapes. The stapes is one of the ossicles in our middle ear, and its vibrations help to convey sound. Thus, the stapedius muscle controls how we hear. The strongest muscle in the body is the masseter. Relative to their weight, these jaw muscles are the strongest around. They close the teeth with a force of 200 pounds on the molars and approximately 50 pounds on the incisors. Every skeletal muscle in the human body is an organ, as they are supplied by at least one artery, which brings oxygen-carrying red blood cells and nutrients to muscle, one or more veins, which carry away wastes and deoxygenated red blood cells, and one nerve, which brings electrical impulses from the brain and spinal cord to the muscle and stimulate it to contract. Each skeletal muscle, as well as each muscle cell, is covered in connective tissue. We will call these connective tissues sheaths. Connective tissue sheaths support the cells and reinforce the entire muscle. From superficial to deep, the connective tissue sheaths of muscle are the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium. Let's pause here for a second to talk about some terminology. Anytime you see the prefix myo, mis, or sarco, you'll know that the structure is somehow related to muscle. For example, sarcoplasm refers to the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. A myofiber is an actual muscle cell. Let's go back to the connective tissue sheaths. For our first sheath, the prefix epi here, epi, means on top of, and mis, as we just learned, refers to muscle. So this is a sheath of dense, irregular connective tissue that is on top of the entire muscle. It binds everything together and separates one muscle from another or from nearby tissues. The epimysium may combine with connective tissues associated with the skin. These connective tissues at the skin are called fascia. The prefix peri means around, and again, mys here means muscle. So the perimysium is a sheath of fibrous connective tissue that surrounds bundles of myofibers. Remember, myofibers are muscle cells. These bundles of muscle cells are called fascicles. The endomysium, so endo means inside and mys means muscle. The endomysium are connective tissue sheaths composed of fine areolar connective tissues, and they surround each muscle. Now let's look at how the structures from the last slide are arranged. These are pictures of the thigh. Let's look at the diagram on the right first. This represents an entire muscle, just one muscle. And it is connected to the femur back here by a tendon. Tendons are strips of connective tissue that are continuous with the epimysium of the muscle. So we can see the epimysium is this kind of whitish covering that goes around the entire muscle. Deep to the epimysium are the bundles of muscle cells called fascicles. So this, for example, let me see if I can draw it. This would be a fascicle. Here's another one. Here's another one. And still one more. So hopefully you get the point. So these are the fascicles. Each fascicle is surrounded by a perimysium. So here's a fascicle that's been pulled out of the muscle, and this kind of whitish covering that goes all the way around the fascicle is the perimysium. Deep to the perimysium are myofibers, or muscle cells. You can see one here. Here's one. Here's another one. So these are muscle cells. Each muscle cell is surrounded by the endomysium, which is this kind of pinkish outline that you can see surrounding the cells. If you look closely, you may also notice these blue tubes, and occasionally there are smaller red ones like this one or this one. These are small arteries and veins. The arteries are represented in red because they typically carry oxygenated blood, so that's blood that's full of oxygen. And the blue represents veins, which usually carry deoxygenated blood. This usually makes the blood take on a darkish purple color, and we represent the vessels that carry that blood using blue. So those are your veins. Notice how they're dispersed throughout the muscle. This helps to ensure good blood flow. Now let's look at the same structures but in a cadaver over here on the left. If you look closely, you can observe many muscles, like, for example, here's the rectus femoris. Maybe you saw the sartorius coming across here. Or maybe you saw the gracilis over here. Each muscle is distinct from the ones around it because of the epimysium. In this image, you can kind of see the epimysium because it gives a whitish sheen to each of the muscles. In this area, you can also see that we have a femoral nerve. So it goes here, and then you can see it extending on down here, okay, going down the leg. And the femoral nerve is going to supply some muscles with electrical stimuli to contract. You may have also noticed the femoral artery here, which goes down the leg. This is that large blood vessel that in all the crime shows, if it gets severed, people have a tendency to bleed out if you don't tie it off. It's a major supplier of blood to the lower extremities, and it's relatively close to the heart, so the blood pressure in this artery is going to be kind of high. And then you might also have noticed this kind of bluish blood vessel here. It comes around like this. This is the femoral vein. The femoral artery and vein, along with other blood vessels, are going to help manage blood flow to the lower extremities. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out, if you look really closely at the rectus femoris here, you probably will notice that it looks like there are fibers going in this direction all the way along the entire muscle. These are fascicles. Okay, the arrangement of fascicles in this particular muscle is called bipinnate. It looks kind of like two feathers that are back to back. Now, the cells of the fascicles again are bundled together by the perimysium, making a unit, which you can actually see in this diagram. Now, you don't have to have a cadaver in order to see some of these structures. It's time for a little A&P in your daily life. Do you ever go to the meat counter and look at the cuts of beef, pork, and chicken on sale? The next time you're there, try to find a cut of beef called the eye of round. The eye of round. Look closely and you may be able to identify some of the structures that we've just described in the previous slides at your butcher's counter. The eye of round is a large cut of meat that comes from the rump section of a cow. If you're lucky, your eye of round will look a little something like this. The whitish layer that you see here, that's the epimysium. Sometimes you'll see adipose tissue or fascia attached to this particular tissue sheath. Now, for most of the muscle, like you see over here, the epimysium has been cut away, but on the eye of round, usually there's a little bit that's left behind, which you can see here. Just under the epimysium, you can also observe fascicles. You can see them in this image because they look like strands that are running in this direction down the meat. You can also notice the fascicles on the cut section of meat. So all of these little bumps that you see here on the end, these are locations where the fascicles have been cut in half. They've been transected. They look kind of like irregularly shaped bubbles. If we were to cut a very thin sliver of the fascicle and stain it with biological dyes and then put it under a microscope, we would see that each of these little bumps or bubbles is made up of thousands of tiny, tiny myofibers, aka muscle cells. Muscles extend across joints and may attach to bones. When muscles attach to bones, they attach in at least two places. We describe the point at which a muscle attaches to an immovable or less movable bone as the origin. The end of the muscle that attaches to a movable bone is called the insertion. These attachments can be direct, meaning that the epimysium of the muscle is fused to the periosteum of a bone or the perichondrium of a cartilage. Alternatively, The attachment may be indirect, where connective tissue wrappings extend beyond the muscle, forming a rope-like tendon or sheet-like tendon called an aponeurosis. So if you look at this figure of the hand here, you can see that a muscle would be down here, but there's a connective tissue sheath that extends in this direction. Okay, the sheet of connective tissue here would be an aponeurosis. There are also connective tissue extensions that go down here and touch or attach directly to the bone. These are also aponeuroses. Another example would be these neuroses that cover the rectus abdominis. Before we wrap up this video, let's try a few review questions. Which of the following is not a prefix used to refer to muscle? Pause this video, think of your answer, and then press play when you're ready to see if you're right. Lemma. Lemma is the only term here or prefix here that does not refer to muscle. But mys, myo, and sarco do. Of the following muscle types, which is the only one subject to conscious control? Is that smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, or cardiac muscle? Or are all of these muscle types subject to conscious control? I hope you said skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, we say, is a voluntary muscle because it is under conscious control. Somewhere in your brain, an impulse has to say, move this muscle in order for the muscle to contract. And you do this consciously. Which of the following muscular functions serves a metabolic function? Remember, metabolism refers to chemical reactions that happen in a cell. Would that be movement, posture maintenance, joint stabilization, or heat generation? Which of these is the result of a chemical reaction? Heat generation, that's right. When your muscle cells break down ATP to cause movement, they also release a little bit of heat, and that heat helps to raise our body temperature. In order to receive a signal to contract, each skeletal muscle must be served by a, or an, is that artery, nerve, vein, or ligament? Nerve, that's right. Nerves send electrical impulses to contract. These impulses come initially from the central nervous system. That's your brain or your spinal cord. In this video, I've described the general function of muscle, which is to cause movement via contraction. Remember that contractions don't always result in shortening of muscle. Sometimes contractions just generate tension. I also talked a bit about how muscle contractions can provide other functions, for example, shivering, that results in heat generation, or the coordinated contraction of facial muscles, which gives us expression of emotion. I also talked about how contraction of muscles helps us to hear sound. There were 4 special characteristics of muscle. They were contractility, excitability, extensibility, and elasticity. You may want to go back and review this point if you don't remember what those terms mean. They will show up on your exam. I also described the 3 types of muscle in the human body. Remember, they are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. You will need to know the characteristics of each of these tissues for your next exam. The final thing that I described was the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle. In my next video, we'll look at the microscopic anatomy of muscle and we'll lay the foundations of muscle physiology. I look forward to seeing you there.